Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here in person today, but also thanks to all the folks who are online listening to this. I'm Pratigna. I am a lead at IHS in the practice program, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to this evening's Publics, which is we have Priya Joseph with us, and she will be talking from her book, Brick Architecture Craft in 19th Century South India, Reading Buildings as Archives. And I'm very excited about this talk because my background is in architecture and I can't wait to hear more from you. And Priya will be exploring historic brick structures across South India and building the narrative around craft and building architecture and all of that. A little bit about Priya. Priya is a professor at Shrishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Bangalore, affiliated to MAHE, where she leads the MDes program. With over 2 decades of experience, her research focuses on material tectonics, gender ecology design, and the history and theory of architecture. She has previously taught at CEPT University, Bern University of Applied Sciences, and co-founded the Living Studio Architects. Her recent work was recognized with the Jeffrey Koch Award for Exceptional Scholarship by the University of California's IASTE Consortium. Am I saying that right? Great. Thank you so much for being here with us. Welcome, and we can start with your presentation. Yeah.
So this is not for effects. I really needed to read. But thank you everyone who's here because I think it needs a solid acknowledgement that people brave the traffic and come, but also those people who are joining in online. And the title of the book, like Pragna said, is Brick Architecture Craft. But what I would like to bring through the book is the reading of cities. Also because we are speaking at IIHS today, and in a way, I would like to hopefully see how the reading of cities through material, what can it reveal, and what the history and the polemics of the time can reveal through a material. My research is around brick, but in a way, material has embedded information from various other times, and brick, as I see it, more as a medium and less just as only a material. So a medium to speak about people, about craft, about agency, about standardization, decoloniality, and much more. And I won't take you through the book and each chapter, and that's not the way I want to say things, but just as a story to understand these other aspects of our cities, of our times, the polemics of our time, and can we look at it from like a material such as brick, which we know, we all know, at least we have touched it, if nothing else. Of course, in the book, there, I take on from from the Indus to the 19th century, and then 19th century is really the crux of the book, where there was a lot of mixing. There was the colonial agencies, there were missionaries, and there was this whole, indigenous ways of practice. And why 19th century, I think, became important was that it started to kind of mix, and what happened there in especially construction practices and like PWD, they still remain. And so it becomes a very important time to look at these intersections and also see, though these times were oppressive, there's a certain intersection that happened very, very importantly in the 19th century. And then in the book, of course, the last chapter is what is the future, because brick is seen normally as a material with high embodied energy, a lot of issues of labor and climate and environment. But at the same time, I would like to point out like why this is still relevant to talk about, at least the history of the thing. So, what I thought is, since we are speaking here, let me take it in a narrative where we look at cities. And IIHS has been looking at cities, and I thought these are the cities that, it's about South India, of course, the book, but also I look at all these cities from Bangalore, Madras. I'm using the older names intentionally, Tanjore, all the anglicized names, Bombay's, because 19th century was really this. And if you really see, I want to take you very briefly. If we go through a lot of documents, bricks in vibrant colors, straw yellow, bright red and brown, unexpected footprints of leopards, dogs, and cattle. All of this kind of is there embedded in. So this is from Mohenjo-daro. It's, the left side one, you see a footprint of a child and also of a goat. And then you see all these structures made out of, when you read the ASI reports, a lot of it is about coins and pots, but equally important are the bricks, because there's so many mentions you will find in the ASI documents about bricks. And hence this large account of how brick was used in the 19th century is formed. There were distinctive sizes, so there's lots of information more in the book, but there are distinctive sizes, shapes and ways of making which are there, all in these reports. Also, to bring you up, there were regional variations. There were things that the whole of South India, it has examples from Vijayanagara Empire, from Karnataka, and Hazara Rama Temple, for example. So I'm not taking you through that, but what I want to say is that until you even come up to the 19th century and this fort very close to us, we all recognize this, you have bricks in different details in different ways, and so it's almost like a memory of humanity in a brick. And so there is a lot to say, but these were some drawings that we were looking at, details of how bricks were done, what were the sizes. So even the sizes, for example, reveal a lot, because they tell you what fuel was used, for example, what so there is a lot of history in that. Let's go to Mangalore for a bit, because that's also a place where I think anybody in this room or sitting online recognizes this style. And rightly so, because this tile we call the Mangalore tile, but it was the Basil Mission tile, also made in the 19th century. And it becomes very important to look, a lot of architects, all of us use saying it's a vernacular material, but it's a little bit questionable, or at least debatable, because this particular pattern is very European, this style. And earlier we used to have these tiles which were, half cylinders made on the potter's wheel. But this patent from 1865, like you see also, is a Basil Mission, which started its production really then, and it took off. On the right, you see that was the traditional way of, and you see the roofing tiles. But this tile, which is known as this, tile, it's really, come from, originally we have been using that. And then on the left, you see there were many variations which we don't talk about. But it becomes very important to look at it in a way that it really formed the landscape of South India in many ways, the cities or towns or factories. And then, Basil Mission was an evangelical missionary group that significantly changed the production of terracotta roofing tiles, bricks, and many other terracotta products. And this Calvinistic worldwide propagation by the mission led to production units all over Canara and Malabar. The mission owns its uniqueness to the fact that it was as much as industrial enterprise as a religious one. And from 1831 to 1920, the mission was involved in several industrial and commercial activities in South Canara. And they were also experimenting, because the Calvinistic approach or the worldview, they had watchmaking and weaving and, textile and things like that, printing also happening. I want to just take you, this is in Mangalore. Somebody corrected my pronunciation of Jeppo, if I'm wrong, if it's too anglicized. But Jeppo is in, Mangalore, and this factory this is an archival image from Mission 21 archives. But this was the first inception of where this got standardized, the tile. And so what happens with standardization is that you can produce it, or you can, mechanize it, and you can produce it in numbers. So their shape, their labor, ultimately the technical knowledge they transfer to artisan communities in Asia and Africa through this. And the Basil Mission established its first production center in Bangalore in 1834. And they had entrusted George Plebs, a trained mechanic who later specializes in printing, with the task of launching a letterpress unit in India. The press he established in Bangalore produced and printed documents in Kannada, Malayalam, Tulu, and more. And what he did is he started working with the local people, and there was a certain intermix because they used the soil of the Netravati, near the Netravati, but also the technology was going up and down, and I'm just going to tell you, this is how the building is now. And if you go there, it's still functioning. I think this is in 2023. I have taken this image. So you will see that it still functions but they start to make extruded blocks, clay blocks, which are more used. But what happened during this time is that mechanization involved steam power, or the gas kiln enabled the mass production of uniformly proportioned terracotta tiles. And these included roofing tiles. I'm going to show the next picture. So you see, this is also this is an exhibition of all the products that they made, from sanitary pipes to little pots to roofing tiles and many other things. So it became very interesting to see that this Mangalore tile was the mission's most popular and widely used machine-made product, and is used by many architects claiming, like I was saying, vernacular, but it has a layered story. And the way our cities look, or the way our landscapes looked, was quite a story of mechanization or this confluence of, or this intersection of the missionary colonial ways and the indigenous ways. So there's a lot of, what I'm trying to point out is that the stories of cities are also weaved with the history of technology in that sense. I just did a small thing in, I think 2018, there was an archivist, and he's still there if he's listening, Bennett Amana. He had collected all these tiles, but we photographed it. So you see these very interesting things all out of clay. And it's fascinating that if you look at material and upwards to a city, there's another kind of a narrative that forms. And it's important when we look at cities, we look at understanding our neighborhoods. I think it's also that all of this makes it in a way. And I want to, this is also an archival image. I will show you. This was a weaving unit initially, then it became a printing press. And so we did a lot of drawings of this to understand how mechanization suppose changes a building and then a neighborhood and a city. So what you will see is that because the tile is a very set kind of an interlockable tile, so you have to have battens and rafters at a specific distance. You can't do it like earlier, you can overlap. If it's a country tile, you can still do with a little imperfection. But now this demands perfection, and not in a good way. I'm not saying perfection is a great virtue or not. That's another debate. But it demanded that everything is precise and not proportionate. So precision was more called by, and similarly, so this is just some of the drawings of that, what we did. But you will see that because the tile sits on a rafter sits on something else, and a wall, everything is kind of, it has to work in a more precise way. This is also another school in Mangalore, where you see on the left, these are all made in clay and terracotta rather, and burnt. And so you place one over the other, and in the center you have this really large cylindrical thing which joins these parts together, and it forms a column which you see on the right, which is totally terracotta. And it starts changing the language of things, but it's mechanized, but it's also assembled. So these kind of things were happening, these kind of, variations were happening. It was fascinating to see how buildings are, or what they support, and how. So this lower picture is in a few years back, and the upper picture is 100 or 150 years. So not much has changed. So it's also fascinating to see some things don't change in a city, but some things do. Also, what was happening at the same time, there were other tiles by British engineers who were trying to do Atkinson tiles, and they were also using the basic form of the country tiles and mixing it up with new forms of things. So it's not that the Mangalore tile was the only thing, but there were other experiments happening. Now I'm going to quickly take you to Burma. I'm just moving around so that it forms the different narratives around cities. But also these, there is this large archive called Professional Papers on Indian Engineering from 1860s onwards. It's all on engineering that was done in India at the time, from dams to bricks to irrigation to a lot of other things. And it's so basically they just recorded what they were doing. And sometimes I realize that it's not only, it's a technical journal, but it's more than technical because it has sociological inputs. It's like we couldn't work with the masons there, or this was not the contracting system. Then we had to smoke with those people to make them friends and have the bricks that we wanted. So it's also an account of a sociological difference that you see in a technical journal. And, these things all came together in this Burma example where they were trying to make bricks. And this is just a quotation from, you see, 1878, Smart, O.G. Smart was an engineer who writes about this. And he's really saying the men go on sucking their cigars, tobacco chopped up with chopped sticks and both rolled up in a dry leaf, much resembling the leaf of the peepal tree, and you follow suit. If you can speak, then is the time to commence chaffing any of the fair damsels that are round about, as the Burmans are very fond of chaff, and yet an individual dreads being chaffed. So it's also like this whole production is very sociological. And this whole idea that technology is very different from society, or they are in different boxes, is something you start to realize. And I think that gives a different understanding of architecture or cities or the world we live in. Now let's go to Madras very quickly. I'm going to, please tell me if I'm going overboard, then I will stop. But Madras also has, because the Madras presidency had a lot of influence of the 19th century British influence, so to say, there were things about plasters and Madras terraces, which we all know about. So if you go on Cubbon Road in Bangalore and you see the St. Andrew's Kirk, it has a roof which is partly Bengal terrace and not Madras terrace. So now Bengal terrace and Madras terrace are similar, but they chose to do a Bengal terrace while Madras terrace was so easily available. But the technology was also traveling with these engineers because, of course, Bengal was where the East India Company was. And then, so these are different things. I will tell you shortly about this image on the back. That's a foundation of St. Mary's Church in Chennai or Madras, but it's also a similar foundation of Taj Mahal. So many people don't know. So these are all terracotta rings which are of different sizes, and there are accounts which say this was better than pile foundation. And then little digging, you realize Taj Mahal also has the same, and many other buildings that were built at that time. And they were, of course, using a lot of indigenous knowledge. This is from Dharampal's work from 1971, but also he's saying about the very superior quality of plaster that Madras had. And just to say that these conversations between the indigenous and the colonial were hegemonic, but also very opportunistic at many times. And that makes the history of these cities, of these 19th century settlements, very, very important to understand. I was talking about this. This is just redrawn, but there were two sizes of these circular kind of wells or terracotta rings which are put, and this is for that building on the right, you see. So it's a largish building, and so they had to sink these wells. They were called sinking wells, and they had to have local indigenous groups who could go down, put a ring, and the water comes up. So it was a certain, almost a risky job to do, and only some people could do it. And the British were, of course, using the local expertise to do that, to an extent that there were sometimes pensions given to these people because of their expertise. But what I'm trying to say is these were all mixing in cities, and a lot of the history is below the earth many times, or above, where the roof where we are sitting. Tanjavur. Now, this is also very interesting for me because also we know the history, Nayakas and Cholas and Marathas, and of course, so many other influences here. But these set of buildings called Chatrams of Tanjavur were of specific importance to me because they were built in brick. And in this book, I elaborated quite an extent. There are 20 of these chatrams, like you see this, and you will see that it's completely in brick, at least in the image that you see. And so, what happens is that Tanjavur is known for stone, of course, also, but brick because it's on the Kaveri, side. And so, all along the Kaveri, you will see a lot of brick being made and good quality. And so chatrams were, more like rest-ins and of places of charity where people go to pilgrimages. So Sarfoji too, who was also very worldly, but also had a Danish, mentor. So he had a lot of influence of the West, but also had this. So there was a lot of mix in these 20 chatrams where they mix details of like volutes, very European volutes, and then they have this very, you see very details which are very, local. So I'm just going to, it somehow distorted the plan, but you see, the ornamentation is also brick. So this whole concept of having, I can just show you in detail. So it's almost like deriving a building sculpturally. So if you see the layers of bricks and it's chiseled out. And so like the building we sit in or many others of our time, we assemble buildings. So it's brick over brick. But when you start to deduct and not assemble, like in this case, the manifestation of that art form or the way these buildings look is something else. So this is almost like chiseled. So, it's deducted and it's not assembled. And so what happens is this whole question of course it's related. I'm not simply Thanks. So, is it on? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. I think it's also to do with how things are manifested in that sense. This is a different manifestation from the point on. So, you see the way it's done is also very different. I mean, I don't know how they did it. They have plaster as thin as 1 or 2 mm. I don't think we don't do it now anymore. Also, these buildings, some of them are used as hostels still, and you see the little volute it's a public building, it's in dilapidation. And also my argument in these things is, if you start to read buildings through its material, you're also reading the buildings as archives. And you're looking at them as a repository which is just lying there. And a lot of work like this, we don't find drawings, we don't find archives or historic. We have to build up a story from other things, like maybe about the economics of that part or who sold what or what transport went. But these buildings are just lying, sort of there in our neighborhood. And even if you go like around Bangalore, I'm sure we find a lot of this. So can we read these buildings as archives? And peel the layers, or metaphorically, but if you peel the layers of it metaphorically, then you start to see what were the choices of people who made it. And so you start to also, that whole point of decolonization, you start to look at the building not from the point of style, but from of tectonics, and then you give agency to, or at least people who made it. And at site, there are small decisions taken, small things done, which is based on who was making a certain part of the building that day, the mason. And so the choices of the mason is highlighted if we start to read these buildings from the tectonics or as archives. Instead of a power-heavy one when you say, okay, this is this style, Maratha style or Chola style. So my argument in the book is also, how can we read our cities as archives, or how can we read our buildings as archives? And then what happens? Does it decolonize really the reading of architecture itself or the reading of cities itself? Yeah, I mean, these are some, this is in dilapidated condition, and that becomes a reason to look in them in detail. Of course, Bangalore, and some of you know this. This is the Fort School in Chamrajpet, and which Intac has very recently in the sense few years, and they were very gracious to give me access to some of their drawings and work. And you see, they've used. I don't have another slide of this, but they've used a lot of jack arch roofs, a lot of these Mangalore tiles, a lot of components which are all mixed opportunistically at that time. So it becomes very interesting to read these buildings and see how they have also something called a brick knock construction, which is very English, and I don't know why they did it here. I mean, I would, but they did it, and it was an opportunistic mix. It was like, yeah, this works here, that works here, and it becomes a very different way of understanding these buildings. This is, some of us have seen it. It is on Coven Road, and this is the left side is there. But this also, I was talking about the Bengal Terrace. It has on the, aisles Bengal Terrace. And where, Dr. Jagdish from IISc, from Astra, I think they looked at it a few years back. And it's amazing that they use a certain technology because it's moving around with people. And so things are shifting. Now it's totally done up, and also you can't see, but this is the plan from the archival, kind of records which we have. Yeah, I mean, I'm just showing, it's a little technical, but of course a little bit difference and how these things all come together. This is the inside of the church. Now this is also interesting. It's a drastic image also because nobody cares about that building. It's a brick building from maybe 1810. It's called Rosary Shetty Church, about 200 kilometers from where we sit now in Bangalore, and highly dilapidated, but in brick. So when I closely, and the water is because the dam was built and nobody cared if it's on the way of the dam and the water is there. So if you have to measure it or you have to look at it, you have to go in the summer a few months. Otherwise, this is how it looks. And it's interesting because when I went closer to see, there were some 9 or 10 sizes of bricks. And that means when you start to look at it, you start to see that this man, of course, commissioned it in a way, this French missionary. He also wrote a book called Hindu Manners, Customs and Ceremonies because he was very popular. He would wear the local attire, and there was a large following, and so the church came about. But you see, there was also, so it's quite huge. This is when the water is not there in the summers, and you will see it's quite a huge church. And I think the way it worked is that a lot of European details are there, a lot of Indian details are there, and a lot of sizes of bricks are there. They didn't say, so it's a mix. It's really, they did what they wanted to do at that time. So when I look, or when anyone looks rather from a point of view of tectonics or the material, you start to understand what were the choices on site and why that was made and what happened. Instead of just, of course, there is a commission and there is some, somebody who wants the church to be built. And on the right, you will see that different sizes, semicircular, this, that made different details of. And now it lies like this, so it's quite a venue for brides and grooms to take pictures because it's so dramatic. But also sometimes as architects we do this just to document and have a record of it. It is as much of importance as much to bind it into an argument and why you're doing it. This works now. Okay, great. So I'm just bringing these images because I don't want to, you can go to the book and look at it more, but just to bring to you that these fascinating buildings and pieces of work are there from the 19th century, which have narratives which have to be read probably from the material perspective. Again, that school that I was saying, the Fort School. This detail, like you see on the right of the Fort School, is not definitely, it's a mixed thing. And then you have a courtyard, then you have, these Mangalore tiles. So you have all these things going on in these very, very beautiful buildings around us. I was speaking about the brick knock construction, and if you, I don't know if this works, I will try. Yeah, this, it's got a timber frame, and then there are bricks which are set inside, and that is the detail. That square is what it is, and it's just not an Indian detail, but it's a very Indian school. Also, this is from Malleshwaram, and there were certain things in 1940s. I'm just moving a little bit forward. There was like brick with reinforcement rods, and that was also tested by British engineers in Bihar. And then in a lot of housing, this thing in Malleshwaram, Professor Jagdish showed me these examples, which was fascinating. So the drawing on the right is redrawn from a 19th century book, but this detail on the left is really, if you go to Malleshwaram, if that house hasn't come down, you will see this kind of experimentation. And what I'm trying to say that there is, if you have to read buildings and cities as decolonial works, you also have to read the hybridity in them. You also have to see that it's not a purist form, whether the building or the city or the detail or the material. And, that made it very important as a work to understand, these buildings, and rather, a critical reading or understanding of the locals and the colonizers was operating in this time. And this decolonial conversation about architecture becomes a very important one in the book, and otherwise for me further to explore. I mean, a lot of people say, what is the future of bricks? And of course, old South Indian brick was much thinner than the contemporary brick, using lesser fuel obtained from agrarian waste such as rice husk. And the making of the brick was a part of the agrarian landscape in India, a society that continues to be agrarian, and brick making was integrated into a larger ecosystem of the land. The production of bricks was linked to the larger ecological cycles in cities such as Bangalore, and the desilting and distilling of tanks and lakes was necessary, and this silt could be used to make the bricks. But the problem happens when this production and the scale is not matching with what is there. And most of us know this, but there is this problem. And some people ask me, like, what is the future of brick in that sense? Of course, like, it has a lot of memory in it, in that sense. It is nostalgic, which are not big things, but it is here to remain. In some way, it is still cheaper, it is still incremental, unlike concrete. And it still is a solution for a lot of people, 1 billion people who cannot afford other materials. So it's important to understand historically how it was used, what does it mean to cities, what does it mean to architecture and design, and then to understand the complexities that we deal with as a material in today's time. And I mean, last, I would just like to say, while the history of brick is complex with intersections and overlaps due to the Industrial Revolution, the scale of economies, colonial and indigenous tensions, and more, it is a history which needs to be understood through thousands, if not millions, of historical buildings lying in ruins just in our cities and outside our cities. And, that's really the understanding of, a city or a material or a piece of architecture from a different narrative you can look at. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priya. Audible, right? Yeah. So how do we get our hands on the book?
So, I don't have myself, so I don't. But can you hear me?
Yeah.
But the Routledge, who are the publishers, they gave a small QR code, and which is lying on the table here. And it's, if you scan that and you pay, it's a little 25% cheaper, which is 1,100 rupees. So if you would like to have it, you can do that. Otherwise, I think it should be available, the Indian edition, in a few days on the Amazon and things like that.
Excellent. Thanks. We'll definitely source some for our library at least, and then, of course, for those who are interested. Thanks so much for your talk. I think it was really sort of interesting also, the breadth of buildings and the coverage of cities that you took us through, which is really nice. So I want to start. Let me ask a question before I open it out to the audience. So my question really is, in this current, and you ended it off very well saying that, materials can give you a sense of how the city is built and, use it as an archive to look at the times in which it was built. Now, in this time of globalization, standardization of materials, the production of building materials, we are using building materials that are produced somewhere else, brought to the country, assembled quickly. What does it do to the practice of thinking of materials as archives? And given the current context of urbanization, the need for so many buildings to be built quite rapidly, and also climate change, the kind of materials we can use. So I'm packing in a lot of things, pardon me for that. But how do you, in this current age and time, how do you think we can think of building materials, what we are using now, as some sorts and sources of archives?
A lot of it is related to standardization. I think what you are asking is because it's standard, it's available, it's mass produced. But also there are different kinds, I think. Also when a potter is doing something, it's standardized, that process. But when you do it in a factory and the scales of the economic scales change, then it means something else. For example, if I can draw parallels to, say, linguistics, languages also at some point are standardized to some extent, but then some words go extinct, but something else happens. And similarly, say in weaving or, I don't know, so many art forms. And I think that scale of economies really changes the way you look at a material in that sense. So, like I was saying, brick, I don't think it's a bad material in the sense it's as bad or as good as concrete or stone or whatever. The problem is the amount we are building, I think. And then that becomes important to address in a very material-centric world that we live in. I think that's something... also, these buildings, they were built... I mean, the process is slower. And I was mentioning in, some other place also that the pace also takes a toll. Now, in a way, we are all prisoners of speed. And that's where the problem is, speed and scale, and not really the material as the way I look at it, I think. And these buildings, some of them are built with very mnemonic kind of understanding. So, you kind of have a mnemonic understanding. Now it's just one over the other, whether you understand or not, or it can just be made. So it's a very different world that we live in generally also. So that's my...
Thanks for that. I have a couple of more questions, but I'll first open it out to audience and then probably come back. So, questions from the audience?
I'm Chandni, I work at IHS. I particularly like the bit that you brought in from Burma because I've stayed there and one sees a lot of brick buildings still there, like old brick buildings that are visible, so that I really liked. I had two questions actually. One on how did you go about choosing these particular stories to tell us? And so just a bit on the method. And the second question, I guess, is that when you're looking back at these archives, we know that at least in present times, brick making is a very labor-intensive, precarious kind of job. And that is why it has such a bad name, at least when you think about it from a labor point of view. Do you see that same bad rep in the archive as well? Like, we are looking at, say, these churches, these beautiful buildings. The buildings as archive is fine, but do you find any mention of either good or bad labor practices in the archive as well?
So you have two questions, no? Like the method, let me say, because that's also very interesting for me. And I'm trained as an architect, so my practice is to draw. And, but then I said, yeah, okay, but this is also history. So I don't have the tools of history, but I went about very ambitiously because this was 19th century. I couldn't. But then when you go to search archives, you feel, there is nothing. And then you see, can you use drawing as not only a method of representation, but also reflection? So normally drawing is used for representation, but can you use it as reflection became one of a very, I didn't think of it that way then, but it became a very important method for me at that point. And of course, to draw from history, the methods which we are not taught and history people taking from us, those were the kind of methods, it was useful for me to think of. But actually, my question was really from my own practice, which as an architect, we do a lot of earth buildings and call it very sustainable. We are sustainable architects. But then you start to question those things also. Like, is it really sustainable? I mean, like, what are we doing? Can we call it sustainable? Those kind of things. Where does the material come from? So, the starting point of this question of this book was really from practice. And then you start digging and this and that, then brick is really rampantly used. You won't, the other problem, to be honest, is that earth buildings which are not stabilized, they're not there. You won't find them now. So, it's very difficult to even get them. But 19th century was becoming increasingly important as I was researching, because this intermix was happening that time, and the PWD documents and things like that, what engineers use today, not much has changed from the 19th century. It's very surprising, but I don't know, us engineers and architects don't bother. So what has happened that these buildings, then I said, 19th century is very interesting, and there was this whole archives, written archives presenting themselves, but also there were no drawings. And I said, okay, let me look at. Then if you're looking at brick, then you go around the Kaveri, along the Kaveri. And then you say, Tanjavur is there and this is there. Bangalore, of course, you have so much right in front. So I said, first I looked at all of India, and it doesn't make any sense. It's too much. You can't, this is like, I don't know, 30 UKs can be fit in India. So what are we saying? Even South India is big. So then I chose certain examples which were dilapidated, which it was possible to study and which it was possible to look at in detail. And of course, I didn't want to choose very monumental buildings. Some of them are, but some of them like Chatrams and other things, schools, were not monumental. And so the everyday practice comes in. And that becomes very important. So these were the sort of methods I was looking at. But I think the overall, I understood as an architect, when you draw in CAD and the Euclid, the method that we use as mathematics and things, it doesn't work when you have to draw that chatram, because it's envisaged differently. The method of making them has been different, and now you're applying. So you start to understand your own practice as a method very differently also. And second question was about the brick as a material. I think, like I'm been saying, the scale of making was never so big in the 19th century. So the scale is a problem. And of course, I believe that in today, you can't have only brick. You have to have an array of solutions. Maybe CSCB, maybe unstabilized earth blocks, maybe terracotta, maybe fly ash. So if you have these array of things and what fits where, in the sense of a very localized, decentralized practice, that may be a solution than to say, let's eradicate brick or let's have everything in brick. So I think that's my position on that roughly.
Before more questions, I'm going to ask you one more question. I know you've picked up, as you were just saying, not necessarily monumental buildings and these everyday buildings that allow you to also look at everyday practices. And these are buildings that don't have any protection necessarily. These are dilapidated buildings that you've picked up. What's your... And I've worked a little bit in conservation, and I, of course, recognize the importance of such structures. But what's your own reflection on the possibility of losing these buildings really quickly? And then how do you read cities and their history through buildings, or even building as archive? That's
when you make ugly cities and buildings, because you can't read from history, I think. I don't know, I don't have an answer, but for me, it is fascinating to think that thing is lying there in front of you. And also, if you're trained as architects, you can draw it out. You can understand a little bit of the detail. And then my reflection was, when you're sitting there, you can do other things in conservation like photogrammetry and things like that. But when you have to sit there and then reflect and then draw it, there is a certain cognition in transferring that detail onto a sketch and then finally to a drawing. And that became also very reflective for me. And that was fascinating. But I don't know if I don't know what we'll do if we don't have these buildings. It's really sad. I don't think we are doing much in the country. So the scope of the book is not about policy, so I'm refraining, but you all know better at IIHS. But these things are very important. And then if we can combine these, break away from these disciplinary things and say, okay, a historian and an architect and a policy maker and everybody have to sit together, that's when I think we all agree that things get going.
Okay, Shivi Anand online has a lot of questions for you, but I'm going to choose one for now. So she asks, drawing from your research, how can we make our cities feel more authentic and less visually and culturally similar to other existing cities around the world?
I think it's a nice question, but I'll go back to the chatrams. Like, if the method is derived differently, it looks different finally. And then it is going to be contextual. So when I was doing this, also, like, if you see the Mahabalipuram, which is stone carved, it's done in a sculptural way, for that matter. I'm not saying go back to that, but it's something that was intuitive. I think this whole global chain business and globalization has somewhere made us look at our cities similarly and methods similarly. And then, like research, if you have a different method, that method has to pertain to the research question in that sense. And I think being true to that contextual inquiry that we do, I think that may be a better way to make our cities look not different, but at least relevant.
Hi, Priya.
Hi, Anjana. It's on.
Okay, so it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you, and raises a lot of questions. And one of that was, you did speak about the PWD and the standardization of it. And right now our cities, they look the way they do is because of the standardization, the processes of standardization. So, are you saying the way they were crafted, obviously in the 19th century, was very different. It was more craft-based. And then do you see a connection of the brick making and then the way the cities changed and they became standardized? In your research, do you see that?
No, in the sense, like, I go back to Gideon's work all the time, and he has a very nice book called Mechanization Takes Command from 1940s. A lot of people say it's dated, but I love that book because it talks about so many other things like standardization, Anjana, you're saying, like, of bathtubs, of chairs, and, all that, and of slaughterhouses. And so when you start to, and there are 3 points that he makes, and I think that holds true for today also, is that the public perception of uniformity changed. Like, you could have a handmade bread and all shape and it was okay. But when we standardize the bread, you could have a crust which is the same color and this sponginess same, and you could cut it and everybody loved that. But was it influential for your digestion? No. But the public perception around, perfection or uniformity, that changed. And the structure of these, at least in my research, like the structure of bricks or tiles changed. Instead of this semicircular one, now it's flat and interlockable. So the structure of the elements of architecture changed. The public perception about standardization or what you need changed, and I think that's still there. And now maybe it's going the other way. Now there's this artisanal bread, and then but it's also only exotic. It's not like everyday use. So I don't know. It's just a here and there answer, but this is coming to my mind.
It's pretty interesting because the bricks, the way they were made, they were very different in different regions. And then once the British colonization happened, then like the PWD per se, they started to make sure that everything was very standard. Because I'm looking at PWD buildings and the standardization, whether you see them in Roorkee or you see them in Bangalore or Mysore, they are very similar, right? So that is where the whole question arises. So if the materials became standardized, then did that contribute obviously to the standardization of the built form?
Yeah.
That is what we are seeing nowadays.
Absolutely, you're right in that.
And then obviously the styles also, did that also become standardized is the next question. Right now we are looking at modern architecture and we all say, oh, they are all boxes. So but did that come from, a certain, it's just an understanding of that makes sense.
Yeah.
But was there any, connection? Is there
No, you're absolutely right. Then it standardizes other things and like, styles and the way we live. But it's also this nice connection. I mean, I'm just thinking about it is to photography and dissemination through printing, for example. Now, if you can print and you can photograph and you can disseminate that, then you can reach this particular style or like, a Corinthian column looks like this and you can, disseminate this information. Whether it's built in that material, what the original craftsman has done or not, it becomes not so important. But what it becomes important is you can disseminate now. And I think that's interesting that history of technology in the 19th century was such that it was aiding all this kind of standardization. And I think, I don't know, we are victims, if I may say, of standardization today.
And I think many things coming together at
Yeah.
that point of time, both technology, material, styles, then being a result of
Yeah.
that, perhaps. Okay, thank you so much. We are on time. If there's another one question, we can accommodate it, but otherwise, I think we can close. We're right on time.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Priya.
very
It was
much.
really fun listening to this piece of work, and we look forward to getting the books once it's out in the market.
Thank you for inviting me and moderating it. Thanks.